Okay, so welcome to the monthly International Development and Innovation Seminar. This will be the last for this academic year, so we will see each other again after the summer. I am Daniele Tori, lecturer in finance at the OU Business School, and I'm pleased today to introduce you to our speaker, Professor Mustafa Erdem Sakinç. Is professor of economics at Université Paris 13 and a researcher at the Centre d'économie de l'Université Paris du Nord. And he's also senior researcher of the Academic Industry Research Network, aka the AIRNet. And he received his PhD in economics from the University of Bordeaux in 2016. And his main research focus is the interaction between business strategies, corporate governance, corporate finance, and industrial relation that specify contrasting and converging corporate practices in the US and Europe. He specialized in aerospace, pharmaceutical, and ICT industries. And he works as a researcher for several national and international research projects, such as FinNov and Easy Growth, which were funded by the framework programs of the European Commission. And he continues to contribute to several other research projects headed by the AIRNet. So today, Erdem will present a paper titled "Is Codetermination in Europe a Barrier to Excessive Financialization and a Path to Sustainable Prosperity?" So we will have a presentation by Erdem, followed by a discussion provided by Pauline Gleadle, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. So just to let you know that this event will be recorded and will be available to rewatch on our website. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Erdem, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniele. I already started to share my screen. I think that's fine. Yeah, thank you. Thank you again. Hello, everyone. I'm Erdem Sakinç from Université Sorbonne Paris Nord, as Daniele told, and my co-author, actually, Emre Gömeç from the Université Kassel, is also here with us today. Yeah, I would like to thank first to the organizers of the International Development and Innovation Seminar Series for inviting us to present to you today the findings of our research on European firms on the theme of the codetermination and financialisation nexus. We have organized this talk in the following way. I'll begin with a short introduction explaining the reasoning of our research, its methodological choice, and its sample. Then I'll provide an overview of the related literature on financialisation, codetermination, and complementarity in order to emphasize and clarify some concepts that are critical for our effort to build an understanding of the underlying links between these three themes. Then I'll move on to our conceptual framework. Before I present our analysis, I'll provide an explanation for our research methodology and sample again. And after I present the results of our research, I'll summarize our findings. I will conclude. I mean, what we propose in our study is a research agenda that considers finance and labor as elements of the same dynamic process. And within the hierarchy of the transformative powers, such as finance, corporation, or the state, labor hardly finds its place, but we consider that labor still remains a major explanatory factor of economic and social transformations, and the impact and financialization of the non-financial corporation has been one of those transformations. And as a result, and as important as finance, the impact of labor on the direction, speed, and depth of these transformations has to be investigated. We also argue that the relation of labor to these transformations particularly happens at the firm level, and thus corporate governance and industrial relations are two major channels that have to be focused on. And consequently, we propose a firm-level investigation of the contemporary means for labor to have access to control through corporate governance and industrial relations that we group under the framework concept of codetermination, which I explain in detail in a couple of slides later. And our period of analysis corresponds to what we call financialization, the period of financialization, period that is characterized by the paradigm of maximization of shareholder value ideology as the ultimate objective proposed for the non-financial corporation. And eventually, our research aims to reveal the micro-institutional and organizational dynamics of corporate financialization and labor in Europe. And we question how financialization and codetermination interact within large European corporations. I mean, how financialization, whose dynamics expressed in terms of maximization of shareholder value shaped corporate resource allocation, and codetermination, whose dynamics expressed in labor's access to corporate governance and favorable industrial relations interact within large European corporations. And we eventually question the relation of labor to the direction, speed, and depth of the capitalist transformation expressed in financialized corporate strategies, as I said, and the role of complementarities between different employee representation forms expressed in corporate governance and industrial relations to strengthen labor's access to power. So I would like to now present a review of those three key concepts, but before codetermination, I would like to just start with financialization, which is kind of more, how can I say, more kind of topic which is studied more extensively, especially since the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And more known to actually critical economists, heterodox economists. This is our first concept that is necessary to review in order to develop our research framework. Its impact on labor is one of the central themes of this literature. And literature on financialization and its consequences for different economic actors took off in early 2000 and entered in a kind of accelerated pace of growth right after the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, as I said. And the corporate financialization, in our understanding, refers to the process of subordination of firm strategies to the accumulation of financial capital mediated by financial markets and guided by shareholder value ideology. In a financialized economy, the performance of a company is evaluated by financial measures, and its primary purpose becomes shareholder value distribution, no matter what it costs to productive investment or employment. And the impact, as I said, I mean, the impact of financialization on labor is one of the central themes of this literature. The main consequence of this phenomenon is the breakdown of the social compromise and the reallocation of corporate resources resulted in the erosion of secure and long-term employment opportunities and income inequity. And in this capitalist restructuring, managers are tasked with active management of assets and downsizing workforce and restructuring of supply chain, relocating of production with divesting less competitive businesses, and M&A strategies in order to reach for high productivity, competitive advantage, high profitability, which are okay, but also, of course, higher shareholder value. And the weakened bargaining power of labor and increasing occupational segregation in terms of economic gains are also tightly connected to financialized corporate strategies. And in line with the findings of this literature, eventually we share the view of financialization as a process of the suppression of labor through the reduction of its share in the returns from productive activity, and a way to discipline employees via internal and external tools and mechanisms with the aim of increasing the share of certain other privileged actors, not only shareholders, but also executives, actually. And the primary means of suppression in order to reduce labor's share is the exclusion of labor from corporate governance and forbidding it to have any impact on corporate strategy. And what is but missing in this literature is that the research on micro-labor dynamics of financialization with systematic evidence to establish the linkages between financial motives and the power of labor. So, I mean, labor is a kind of passive victim of what has been happening since the last 40 years. In this literature, but what we just will propose, I mean, in our framework, that it should also be considered as an actually active actor to be included in any analysis on capitalist transformation, etc. Our second concept that we review in our paper is codetermination. We'd like to give some more space to this concept first with a small discussion on its meaning and its history. I mean, the word codetermination attracted attention of many social scientists and policymakers, as well as business world and media as an alternative model to shareholder value in the last years, especially after some policy proposals, I mean, by some US senators and also some discussion in other countries. But it is not a new concept. I mean, it's a system for employee consultation and participation in corporate decisions within the business sector. I mean, the actual meaning is often unclear. Common understanding is only the board level employee representation that you see on the upper left part. However, the extent of codetermination also includes formal and informal arrangements that provide labor the possibility of actively participating in the shaping of their working environment, as well as different roles and responsibilities of employee organizations formed outside the business organization, such as trade unions. Although the implementation varies greatly in each country, employees participate codetermination model through national level organizations like trade unions, company level establishments like works councils. I mean, works councils are also just called shop floor work or workplace employee representation, or companies' transnational committees like European or World Works Councils, and also, of course, trade union participation, collective bargaining agreements, international framework agreements, and even employee share ownership programs. And then in this case, employees act as also a shareholder and try to just have access to corporate governance through the rights that are given to shareholders. I mean, the idea dates back to 20s Germany, actually, but its full institutionalization was in the early 50s with the act in Germany again, with the act which regulated board-level employee representation in specific industries, and it later was extended to all companies with more than 2,000 employees in Germany in the 70s. And following Germany, mandatory or voluntary, I mean, codetermination acts were passed in many other European countries. Latest ones were in France. I mean, there were before, but some improvements in board-level employee representation last decade. The same attempt actually took place in the UK as early as 1977, but it failed to pass and lost ground with the election of Margaret Thatcher, Conservatives, late 70s, early 80s. I mean, you can see here on the map how they just actually usually categorize under three groups. The widespread participation rights were there, I mean, especially board level employee representation is strong, and some other countries with limited rights, usually just this board level representation usually just is reserved only to state-owned or formerly state-owned, now privatized companies. And also in many other countries, there are no such rights at all. And we get back to the literature on this concept. I mean, codetermination model has a strong legal recognition against the implementation of the US-style shareholder value orientation and also short-termism. It is considered as a slow for some researchers, but it is also considered as a slow transition process to shareholder value capitalism at some point, or in some case, for some researchers, a negotiated form of the US-style shareholder value model that incorporate changes through stakeholder consensus, or for optimists, maybe we can say a sustainable alternative to shareholder value. Based on such kind of understandings, number of theoretical and empirical studies were done to examine the effect of different components of codetermination on various aspects, indicating employee welfare, wage growth, employment growth, and improved working conditions. I mean, for example, there are research out there, I mean, finding kind of relations between codetermination and increased payroll, but also, I mean, reduced profitability and reduced shareholder payouts. In some research, it acts as a firm-level wage negotiation body when sectoral bargaining agreement is absent. In some other research, it is correlated with high employment growth, especially in Germany. It stands as a barrier against corporate restructuring and against hostile cross-border company takeovers. It promotes modern forms of work, and it's not always something kind of adversarial. It's not only about just protecting the rights of the employees, but there are research out there finding proof that it promotes also modern forms of work, innovativeness, further training of employees, and even more patent filings. So, I'm sorry. This is the codetermination literature is not that wide as financialization literature, of course, but kind of healthy literature and still growing. And our third concept necessary to build our framework is complementarity. It's a concept used in organizational and institutional economics to explain situations where the coexistence of two or more organizational or institutional arrangements and practices increases their impact on a specific outcome. It can be, especially in the case of, as our interest is mostly on institutional economists broadened its use to a much wider interrelation between different institutional domains as wide as labor, finance, ownership, technology, and innovation in terms of their joint development and impact. Broadened use means here that one kind of context or one just arrangement happening in the labor domain can just couple with another arrangement in a completely distinct domain like ownership, and have a kind of specific outcome for the firm in terms of like productivity or in terms of profitability, etc. So I mean, it can be still helpful concept as we just still lean on in our research, but if we don't fall into an everything connected to everything else situation, which is observed, especially within the varieties of capitalism approach. I mean, in that respect, actually, the regulation school provides a careful discussion of institutional complementarities that happen not only at the macro level, but also at techno-competitive industrial structures. For example, Boyer claims that strict complementarities between institutions that belong separate domains may exist, but it's hard to explain, actually. For example, the adoption of certain shareholder value features along with still strong institutions that protect the interest of labor, like codetermination in Germany, is an example. I mean, he provides this as an example that completely just distinct forms can coexist, and that cannot be explained by the idea of institutional complementarity. And then he proposes actually that microcompatibility of shareholder value and codetermination is only possible through certain macroeconomic imbalances that happen outside of the corporate finance or industrial relations, contrary to the coherence of the set of interrelated national institutions. So, I mean, complementarity can happen, but we can only explain it through actually macro dynamics over the very long term of the economic kind of histories of nations, I mean regions or the world. So, I mean, again, I would like to highlight that, I mean, that we need to just handle with, we need to take this concept very cautiously, and that's actually we just want to do in our just research that I will explain again further when I just present our conceptual framework. Yeah, and this is our conceptual framework that structures actually our analysis. I mean, this figure represents our framework of the institutional and organizational foundations of the dichotomy between labor and finance, or we can just also say labor and capital, that happens at the firm level. The intersection theme of codetermination and financialization is value, actually, which is created and extracted by different actors via productive activity, investments, and also, of course, distribution of returns among them. In our framework, financialization, you see on the right-hand side, happens through both corporate governance and corporate strategy channels. On the governance side, shareholder representation, their activism and managerial incentives are the primary mechanisms to realize the aim of maximizing shareholder value. And the most common methods of materializing this objective are cash distributions to shareholders and also the share-based executive pay to redirect their focus of the focus of corporate executives to the financial performance of their companies. I mean, financialized companies prioritize share buybacks and dividends over productive investment, and their executives receive a substantial proportion of their remuneration in the form of company stocks. In addition, I mean, shareholder activism and particularly hedge fund activism has also become an important facilitator of financialized corporate governance. And on the strategy side, on the bottom, shareholder value corporate strategy refers to the activities which aim to alter companies' productive organization with the same ultimate objective to maximize financial extraction. They do it through the reallocation of funds, through reorganization of the productive activity, Two primary methods to do that, which sometimes happen simultaneously, are those extractive mergers and acquisitions and corporate restructuring via various cost-cutting strategies such as outsourcing, offshoring, divestitures, disposals, layoffs, of course, and other measures to reduce labor, in brackets, costs. And for example, the extractive mergers and acquisitions, we refer to actually excessive payments for overpriced acquisitions here, with the aim to just kind of acquire companies and then just rip apart their productive organization. Of course, the ultimate aim would still be just improve profitability and productivity, etc. But with also quite a lot of damage to the existing productive organization of the acquired company. And also, increased borrowing, and especially, increased borrowing to just execute actually again the reimbursements of the previous borrowing, debt reimbursements, and also, of course, increasing interest payments that we just consider as part of the value extraction of financial actors via within this framework. On the right-hand side, you see the codetermination angle of our framework, which incorporates the mediums through which labor has a say over the allocation of corporate resources and their productive use through their access, again, to corporate governance, but also to the industrial relation, the extent of their power in industrial relations. Or, of course, as we just try to underline, both of them at the same time. And similar to the shareholders, but with much limited rights compared to them, labor's access to, much limited rights in terms of corporate governance, labor's access to corporate governance can happen through their elected representatives in company boards, board-level employee representation. They have also access to shop floor employee representation through works councils, as I said, and also equivalent representative organs to negotiate elements, sometimes even include, strategic decisions. On the other hand, different than trade union membership, or to a lesser extent, access to collective bargaining, labor's access to corporate governance is not a universal norm that every company in Western economies have, as I explained previously. And as our analysis also shows, actually, national rules and practices widely differ, and there are also marked differences within the same country, sometimes due to sometimes unpleasant rules and requirements that companies can sometimes sidestep. Employee shareholder activism also exists, actually. It is another means to advocate their rights, analogous to shareholder activism. In countries where it exists, campaigns are usually endorsed by trade unions. And what we propose in our framework, the complementarities within the same domain only, like within the domain of capital or within the domain of labor, still matter. And they may happen between the institutions of the same domain, as I said, and specific mechanism within each institution. They eventually serve for the same purpose, such as kind of wage share, increasing wage share or job security for labor, or increasing shareholder value, increasing distributions for capital, or which is not part of our framework, but it can be also kind of social welfare, increasing social welfare for the entire society. So we have a kind of much narrower view of complementary than the literature usually just proposes, which is only about, our complementarity is about coordination and coherence between the institutions of the same domain. We agree with the regulationist view that when the issue is about relations between institutions and corporate practices that organize and protect the rights of different interest groups, conflicts and compromises determine the dominant character of the consequences of corporate actions and institutional change. So they generate highly uncertain results that can only become identified in the very long term, as I said. So from our point of view, codetermination itself is the expression of a compromise between the interests of capital and labor over the degree of labor's control over corporate, over its own wage share, and also over the corporate strategy. And in our framework, again, we just view codetermination as a broader configuration, which refers to employee representation and participation both at corporate governance and industrial relations levels, which complement each other, again, with the aim to maintain and expand the power of labor. And those complementaries particularly matter for the implementation of codetermination for labor, or the implementation of financialisation for capital. In the case of labor, this happens through productive value creation to be reutilized, to retain and reinvest in capabilities, and to maintain secure employment and superior benefits. As an example, I mean, trade union representatives can also become board members as employee representatives and maintain the flow of information between different organs inside and outside of the company to the interests of labor. Or employee shareholder activism can be performed by trade unions, which may have larger resources than the company level investment fund of the employees, and larger resources also in terms of, I mean, visibility, etc. So, I mean, yeah, there are just these complementaries. They exist, but within the same domain, same institutional domain. So after this introduction to our framework, I would like to just mention about our methodology also. We just propose an empirical methodology which seeks to measure the labor's influence through publicly available data on a group of European corporations for the moment for 2009 and 2019 period, but our aim is to extend it from 2005 to the latest year, that we will also include the financial crisis period and also the COVID-19 period. Our focus is non-financial corporations, of course, I mean, of the most capitalized stock indices in 5 European countries. And again, our aim is to include also Italy to our just group, then there will be 6 countries. And to perform our analysis, actually, we follow 3 steps. In the first step, we identify the different mechanisms that employees of a company can utilize in order to have access to control, with the aim to influence how their companies allocate resources and returns from productive activity. To do so, we compare the data of different forms of employee representation and the evolution of the payroll and workforce during the period of analysis. And in line with the complementarity hypothesis, we aim to show the relation between the influence of labor and the protection of the labor force against internal and external wage and employment shocks, expressed in terms of an elevated level of workforce representation at every level of participation. So we are concerned if there is complementarity between those different forms of representation. In the second and third steps, we identify the results of allocation decisions executed under the influence of labor or under the influence of capital, of course, I mean, expressed in monetary figures. In the second step here, you see, I mean, we show to what extent companies allocate their financial resources on different uses. We perform this analysis, the sources and use of funds analysis, to compare the proportion of financial resources from where they are originated and how they are utilized. And in the third step, we show the evolution of the proportional distribution of returns among major stakeholders, and we seek to show the dynamics of the extraction of returns from productive activity by different stakeholders in relation to their contribution to the value creation. And in order to have a more homogeneous sample, we excluded several sectors which are overrepresented in some indices than the others. The sectors we have in our sample will include manufacturing, technology and related services, broadcasting and advertising, and energy. And our methodology is based only on the existence of the forms of employee representation without going deep into the comparison of their specific levels of importance in different countries. I mean, this is a limit of our methodology, of course. It is, I mean, it just collects the same similar type of data, which may mean a bit differently from one country to another. And it is also limited to the extent of data availability, of course. That, for example, I mean, there will be further data we would have liked to include, like data on training, data on turnover and such stuff, but there is no consistent data available at the firm level among those companies. And specific elements in our conceptual framework, such as corporate restructuring or the union membership rate, I mean, such stuff also cannot be represented in methodology and analysis due to lack of firm level data again. So finally, I can just start to present our results. We start our analysis with the employee representation data. In line with our complementarity perspective, we provide in one figure all forms of representation. The aim is to show the collective impact of different forms on productive and financial outcomes. So we hypothesize that the cumulative strength of the different forms of representation and participation has a higher potential to influence decisions that have direct or indirect consequences on the company and on the, or especially on the labor force. The figure shows our findings that Germany and to a lesser extent Sweden and even to a lesser extent France present the most complementarity between different mechanisms on average. Board level representation has been the most prevalent among German and Swedish firms, although the proportion of employee representatives in company boards in Germany is on average 2 times higher than the second country in our sample, Sweden. And on company works councils, we need to clarify one fact. This mechanism is not a Europe-wide standard method of shop floor representation, while in some countries like France in our sample, the formation of company works councils are mandatory. In others like Germany, they are not, but they are still widespread among large corporations. On the other hand, in many other European countries like Finland, Sweden, and also the UK in our case, there is no formal legal requirement to form up shop floor representation organs. Like in Finland and Sweden, unions are the most common agents for shop floor representation. And also in the UK, but only if they have sufficient support or recognition. But I mean, in Nordic countries, in Finland and Sweden, trade union representation is much more widespread and legally protected with stronger formal capabilities to protect the rights of the whole workforce in a company. So the low level of shop floor representation among Finnish and Swedish companies in our sample actually does not reflect that workplace rights are less protected in these 2 countries. And as you see, I mean, the trade unions, the presence of trade unions and collective bargaining agreements are the most prevalent forms of protecting employee rights and their representation also in our sample. But again, UK companies have also the lowest levels of these forms. So our complementarity perspective proposes that the cumulative strength of the different forms of representation has a higher potential to influence decisions, as I said, that I will present soon in our sources and use of funds analysis. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, and these actually results, these complementarity results that I will just still go further with findings, are consistent with the firm level findings of the literature of the complementarity of codetermination and industrial relations institutions. I mean, there is some evidence already, I mean, available out there, just showing the kind of synergy between different forms of employee representation and its impact on specific outcomes. I mean, again, still in this part, we just focus on the evolution. We also focus on the evolution of wage share and workforce dynamics in order to explore analogies between them and other employment and financial dynamics that we just included into our analysis. I mean, here you see the proportional change in employment during this period among those, on average, I mean, among those countries. The percentage of domestic and European employment has gradually diminished in all countries on average, except the European employment of UK, European and world employment of the UK companies, actually. But I will explain, I mean, very briefly why it is like that. I mean, for example, I mean, the most significant decline in the proportion of domestic employment is observed among French, Finnish, especially Finnish and French and Swedish companies. The starkest difference between actually the total employment growth and the negative change in the proportion of domestic workforce is observed among French companies, but German companies have the lowest level of proportional decline in domestic and European employment. As of 2019, the average domestic and European employment levels of German companies are also the highest, actually. I mean, that I don't show it in this chart, but we have the data. I mean, what is the proportion of home country employment for each company? I mean, the situation with actually the UK, why Europe and the world employment increased. I mean, actually, world employment is increased for all the companies because they are large companies and they are just executing quite regularly acquisitions, and they are just growing by acquisitions especially. But the explanation of the increase in European employment is basically due to Brexit. I mean, up until the year of Brexit, we observed the same trend for the UK companies like in others. But after Brexit, actually, the European employment of UK companies started to increase rapidly. This chart shows the average employee payroll growth during this period. Again, it is the highest among German and Swedish companies, while it is the lowest among French companies, which, as we have shown, I mean, here the home country employment of Finland and France considerably reduced, and considering that comparatively higher paid workforce at home or in Europe, that is understandable why the payroll is not growing as fast as other countries. Overall, I mean, the positive impact of employee representation in Sweden and Germany on payroll and workforce may reflect complementarity between different forms of representation and their collective impact on these outcomes in favor of labor. And this is the second part of our analysis. Now we just focus on the financial results, financial numbers of the same companies. This table actually presents the proportion of total sources and uses of funds of the companies in our sample. We provide two different samples from Germany due to massive difference in total borrowing when we include three automobile companies of the country. The inclusion of the borrowing of their financial services divisions in their consolidated statements substantially inflate the proportion of their borrowing. That's why actually it is better to compare Germany without automobile companies with the rest of the sample. I mean, as you see, actually, I mean, the internally generated financial resources to fund current and subsequent operations and investments, they are the highest. On average, I mean, 2/3 of their just sources of funds are internally generated. And borrowing is the second most important source of funds for all companies. Between 1/5 and 1/4 of the total funds are externally borrowed. And another observation is the strikingly low level of equity finance as a source of funds. On average, with 2.7%, France has the highest level of stock issuance as an external source of funding. Although actually this picture is highly questionable, large French companies have by far the highest level of issuing share options, stock options to their executives and other high-ranking employees in Europe. Thus, I mean, an important part of French companies' equity finance is actually composed of proceeds from shares on exercise of stock options provided by their employees. I mean, it's employees actually paying to their companies when they want to buy their options from the company, of course, at a reduced price, and they will eventually just sell them on the market and make it just a kind of realize gains actually out of it. And the lower part of the table shows the primary uses of funds of the same sample of companies. I mean, between 35 and 41% of total funds are allocated to productive uses, including R&D and capital expenditures. I mean, UK has the lowest and Sweden has the highest levels, respectively, but these figures have to be regarded still cautiously, as the composition of each country sample can be tilted towards companies with higher or lower levels of productive investment, although we selected the companies in identical industries for each sample. Nevertheless, I mean, the difference between the lowest and highest group is not extra wide. I mean, and the companies in each sample allocate similar amounts of funds to productive investment on average. But major financial uses of funds tell another story. On average, UK companies allocate 27% of their total funds in financial uses, while this amount is as low as 18% among German companies and between 20 and 23% for other countries. I mean, and due to heavy borrowing, debt repayment is another major use of funds. Finnish companies have the highest level allocated to this use with around 30%. The others is around 20%. Now, last part of our analysis, we just provide a comparison of the shares of value that is extracted by major stakeholders of the companies in our sample, including employees, shareholders, creditors, and the governments. I mean, being the primary actors behind value creation, of course, employees receive the largest share of value relative to the share of other stakeholders. These include wages, salaries, social benefits, and other employee remuneration. But as you see, I mean, the share of the UK employees is considerably lower than the companies in other countries. During this period, their share fluctuated with an average of 57% for the whole period, but the employees of German companies appropriated the biggest share, in some years close to 80%. And despite contributing with a very low percentage of sources of funds, as we have shown in the previous slide, around 2%, and when you just exclude executive stock options, even just only close to 1% of total sources of funds, shareholders, on the other hand, extract between 10% and a quarter of total value allocated to these four stakeholder groups on average over the period. Dividends are the major form of value extraction by shareholders, but share buybacks are still an important form of extraction among UK and French firms. And in contrast to the value share of employees, UK firms allocate the highest percentage of resources to their shareholders, only followed by Finnish companies at a distance. And buybacks and dividends combined, shareholders of German companies extract the smallest percentage with around 9% on average over the period, even less than 10%. And we also observe a gradual decrease in tax payments after a recovery after the crisis in 2007, 2008, and a steep fall in interest payments until the last year of the period. As we know, the reason, decreasing interest rates were also kind of in favor of the corporations, but now it is entering into a kind of increasing trend. So to conclude, our overall findings indicate that the companies of the countries where employee representation is the strongest in terms of higher proportion of employee representative board members, robust workplace representation via company works councils or other kind of committees, trade unions and high level of trade union presence, and also collective bargaining agreements. On average, they have the least financialized companies regarding lower levels of financial payouts, higher levels of productive investment and wage share, and lower levels of proportional employment loss, particularly in their home countries. The findings are consistent with our conceptual framework and research methodology, which highlight the complementarity of different representation and participation forms as a barrier against financialization. But few studies which question the impact of complementarity refer to the strengthened impact of codetermination on common themes such as productivity, investment, employment growth. But our study is quite unique in identifying also the collective element of codetermination, collective effect of codetermination elements on multiple themes of corporate finance, as well as on stakeholder shares and the proportional situation of stakeholder shares. So labor is not always a passive victim of shareholder value maximization, and in the countries where codetermination is stronger, the negative consequences of financialization, which are extensively cited in the literature, such as decreasing wage share, reduced personal expenditures, accelerated employment reduction, are either absent or alleviated. But our study has also its limits. As I previously said, our methodology is limited to the extent of data availability, and a large part of our codetermination data is binary. It does not reflect the qualitative and quantitative strength of some elements, such as the extent of power of the trade union presence in the company, or the extent of the collective bargaining agreements and their depth in terms of the topics covered in those agreements. We don't have such kind of qualitative structuring of those representation forms. And one more issue, we have not so far extended our analysis on financialization to one of its important elements, the executive pay. We are currently also collecting data on this issue, and our interest is particularly on the performance criteria to determine the level of variable pay of executives. The results actually are not promising in the sense that very few companies establish non-financial, non-share price performance-based criteria to determine the level of variable pay of their executives. I actually have some slides, but I mean, maybe we don't have enough time. I mean, we can just skip. And the latest corporate governance discussions all over the world are still far from questioning the dominant position of shareholder value ideology, despite their minimal contribution to the productive activity, especially in large companies. On the contrary, there's a wide gap between labor's contribution to value creation and its limited access to control, which results in a substantial reduction in its power over the period of financialization. And our study tried to document this gap through a comparison of the mechanisms that employees utilize to influence industrial relations and to influence corporate governance, related decisions, and financial expressions of power dynamics between different stakeholders. We claim that questioning shareholder value ideology actually requires a strong support for codetermination in any country or any region in the world. And I mean, I can skip those. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Erdem, for a very interesting presentation. I think now we are moving to Pauline, and let me just share the slides. Should be here. Okay, let me try these. Can you see those?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes, thank you very much. I won't use all the slides, but I'll say when I go through, because I think we're a bit short of time. This is a very important topic that Erdem is looking at, because as he has mentioned, in most of the theories of value or value theories, labour is viewed as the main and often indeed the only creator of value, of profits, if you want to put it very loosely. So it's a bit of a paradox, particularly in countries like the US and the UK, that there is usually no representation of employees on boards. Occasionally it has been raised, like a few years ago, the TUC here raised the proposal to get employee representation in boards. Reaction was very hostile, and nothing had happened. Okay, so let's have a look. Could you go forward a few slides? I'll tell you when to stop. Daniele. Okay, so if you go past onto the next one. Yes, you know, I agree, as highlighted in yellow here, that the interaction of board representation of employees and its interaction with financialisation is likely to be dynamic rather than submissive. I mean, we know that from all firm level work and case studies on a whole lot of different phenomena. Could you go to the next slide, please? Yes, and Erdem has mentioned, as I've highlighted here, that labour is not always a passive victim of shareholder value maximisation. So perhaps slightly surprising, but as I'm near to some of those issues, I'm not exactly astonished by it. So if you could go to the next slide, Daniele. So yes, as I said, there are few studies which question the impact of complementarity of different phenomena, and a few that refer to the strength of codetermination on common themes within financialisation, such as productivity, productive investment, and employee growth. Could you go to the next slide, please, Daniele? So that was the sample that the paper has used. It's a big sample, and importantly, it's obviously non-financial companies that Erdem and Emery have looked at, because that is a common concern within the financialisation literature, is what impact, which is sometimes assumed to be one direction only, is financialisation having upon non-financial corporations. Of course, the reality is that outcomes can be different and dynamic. Could you go next, please, Daniele? Yeah, I mean, there are a few issues with this. I mean, at the moment, Erdem and I are working on a related paper together, obviously not looking at codetermination. But one of the issues that strikes me very much, particularly when you're looking at multinational companies, is this issue of institutional arbitrage, where basically companies decide to locate certain parts of their activity abroad, often for tax planning reasons, but there may be other reasons behind it as well. And there's obviously the Lever and Montalban study of 2010, which looked at this in the case of Sanofi. Why this is important is that particularly in multinational companies, such institutional arbitrage is likely to distort our understanding of the link between such issues as codetermination and financialisation. So it sort of blurs the picture. Could we have the next slide, please? So further research, and this is something Erdem and I have also discussed, and we're starting to do ourselves, is I would suggest in this case investigating the relationship at the level of the individual non-financial corporation, so as to explore in more details the dynamics of this possible relationship across different types of NFCs in the various country studies. And I suggest a number of issues next that could be explored in this connection. Daniele, could you, right? Yeah, now a major issue that concerns me, and I've had this discussion with one academic in particular about this, Colin Haslam, is while we might both, and Erdem might approve of codetermination as a way to giving employees voice, so to speak, often the employee presented to the information presented to employee directors may be really complex. So particular examples of this would be activities by the firm as involving the use of complex financial instruments and related transactions. And these would be so complex, as happens in the world, that even most qualified accountants would struggle to understand the implications of what they were looking at. And of course, we have cases in the past, like Ashanti Goldfields, where the finance director was persuaded by investment bankers to engage in particular transactions, which were so complex he didn't understand them. The company ended up in big trouble. And, you know, we can see also this situation of lack of understanding affecting employee directors also. Next slide, please. Okay, so further limitations on the power of codetermination in practice, and this is something Erdem and I had discussed, is the possibility of gaming the system, and that even in countries such as Germany, where they have long established employee-friendly labour laws, management may ensure that their workforce falls beneath the level needed where codetermination is mandated. So they would basically rather not have anything to do with it. Then another example I give, and this is actually from the case of my daughter who's been working in Berlin for a few years, is basically new recruits may be hired. they have to do their probationary period, in which in some cases they worked extremely hard, worked to death, and then just before the end of the probationary period, they're told, no, sorry, we're not hiring you, because obviously once they're hired, they have much better employee protection. So I was just thinking that all these factors will tend to sort of blur the picture. Could you move to the next slide, please, Daniele? So finally, other factors that I think are likely to come into play in limiting the effectiveness of codetermination as a brake on financialisation. And again, Erdem and I have discussed this. What I would ask is, what else is happening in Germany in particular that might weaken the power of codetermination in acting as a brake on financialisation? And the obvious thing for me would be the importance of outside financing from financial markets. We know Frankfurt has become very important, as opposed to greater reliance on retained earnings. And then the second point, if outside finance is highly important, where is this finance coming from, given that traditionally we always think of Germany as having relied on bank financing, which is a great deal more forgiving than financing from capital markets in very broad terms. Daniele, could you go to the last slide, please? Okay, so that's pretty much it. Lots of issues around there. I think it's really interesting work, but like all research, as I told a student of mine rather emphatically last week, research is the art of the possible. So it's very interesting what you and Emery have done, Erdem, but inevitably I see certain issues with it and how it could be developed. So thank you. Thank you,
Pauline. Thank you. Let me just stop sharing these.
Thank you very much.
Can you hear me okay? All right.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Pauline. Erdem, do you want to briefly reply to the points Pauline made? Then we can open the floor for Q&A.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, thank you very much, Pauline, for your important remarks. I mean, these are exactly the most important points that we just need to consider, and we need to go deeper in our research. But again, with some, of course, limitations that we won't be able to just extract data related to such issues. I mean, like the level of how can I say, the ability of employee representatives to read company financial statements or just propositions and such stuff. I mean, like as I've presented, we cannot know every detail what is written in the collective bargaining agreements. I mean, which topics they are covered. I mean, it can even differ from one industry to another. I mean, forget about national differences. I mean, this is these. I mean, these are the issues that has to be just, of course, have to be in any case, but has to be kept in mind. I mean, another topic is the issue of confidentiality. This is another topic that employee representatives usually just propose, that they cannot just easily share information with their comrades. I mean, they're just the other employees, even other representatives. I mean, in some cases, like board level employee representative cannot share information with the shop floor employee representative. I mean, these are definitely the topics that limits our research. But in any case, I mean, we just wanted to show this in order to just establish, I mean, again, this link between codetermination and financialisation, and as you said at the very beginning, to show that labor is not very kind of passive kind of victim and its rights are like collateral damages. I mean, we want to show that it is still a kind of important actor to understand capitalism and also the firm level dynamics, corporate finance, corporate strategy, corporate governance. Thank you. I mean, thank you. In any case, I took notes and I will definitely just develop them a bit further in our discussion part. I mean, our paper that we are still drafting nowadays. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Erdem. Now I would like to open the Q&A session. So is there any question from the participants? You can either turn your camera on or write into the chat and I can read your question. I see there is a question in the chat box. Michael, do you want to talk or should I read out your question?
Please read it out.
Okay, as you prefer.
Yeah, I prefer that. Yeah. Thank you.
So Michael writes, thank you, Erdem and Pauline, for sharing your insights. Very interesting. I've been working as an assembly line worker for 26 years in German car industry. From my point of view, the codetermination, or so to say, rights for worker to ever say within the shop floor processes, was a huge success story from the early 1990s to the mid 2010s. It really did improve productivity without much investment needed, with just the collective knowledge of the workers involved in the production process that paid out. After that period, this kind of micro-level codetermination really deteriorated. Can you say something about that, the reasons, or whether you have other experiences and so on? Thank you.
Sorry, do you want to talk about that, Erdem?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there is literature out there actually, just as I just tried to present at the very beginning, that highlights, I mean, such facts, especially to understand if this shareholder value understanding is gaining ground in Germany or not. I mean, and I mean, that was a vivid discussion in the early 2000s, and there is research out there that showing actually this deterioration. But as I try to just propose, some say it is a kind of, yes, it is a transition to shareholder value understanding, or just it's a kind of hybrid form now emerging in Germany. I mean, even though there are elements of shareholder value, codetermination is still strong and protecting rights of employees. I mean, in terms of literature, I mean, the results are quite inconclusive, that we cannot either say that everything turned bad in Germany and it's just a kind of regular financialized country with financialized corporations, or we cannot say also that everything is still okay. I mean, everything is still positive for labor, like in the period before financialization. And in our other research, I mean, actually, we also try to show that financialization arrived to continental Europe quite lately. I mean, in terms of just in terms of its most kind of visible dynamics like shareholder value distribution, executive pay, etc. But yeah, I mean, there is still apparently need to do further research to show if there has been a kind of remarkable change compared to this period. But then we need to go very deep into this topic by doing, I mean, industry level analysis, like case studies, or even company level analysis. And And yeah, I mean, that's how we can see. But I just can say that how the things are going on in France, actually. I mean, the equivalent of works councils here in France, they were just institutionalized in the 70s. I mean, and they just turned into a kind of bureaucracies, like everything happens in France. I mean, just and they are really kind of formal bodies to discuss only just specific elements, and there's even a kind of business that company gives you some reports, and then you just go and search for consulting to understand them, and then return back to just respond. And it's a kind of very bureaucratic, kind of very boring process with very kind of limited impact on the outcomes, considering the kind of financialized orientation of French companies, especially the large companies. I mean, it may be still be working in small companies, but I mean, again, I haven't just read anything specific in the literature in terms of its impact. I mean, this is again an area actually left to industrial relations literature only, without just considering the impact on corporate governance, corporate finance, corporate strategy. Actually, I mean, they have power even to just comment on strategies of their corporations, I mean, employees through these works councils, but it's rarely used, and every time they cite the same reasons: we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough capabilities to understand those. I mean, this is just kind of, I mean, kind of situation completely kind of blocked, which goes nowhere, I mean, in terms of the benefits for the labor. Thank you.
I think in terms
Thank you, Erdem.
sorry.
Yeah, no, go on, Pauline.
I was going to say, I think in terms to understand this, it'd be interesting to go back and see if there's anything from a business history perspective that might sort of account for these changes. I say this with some interest because I was largely brought up in Germany. And so when I was there, sort of up to the end of the 1970s, it was very much the era of the highly qualified engineer who sort of ran everything. And the finance had a very low status. It would just be interesting to see even how that changed after that. Because of course we know the UK was very different in terms of economic development and sort of who had power on boards and so on.
Thank you, Pauline. Is there any other question from the audience? Anyone? You might have
ask you, Michael, what are you doing at the moment? Do you act as an employee representative on a company board? I don't know that he's heard me, actually.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for your...
I said, do you act as an employee director at the moment?
Yeah, I'm an active employee in the car industry right now.
Yes.
And what I observed is that maybe due to capitalization, financialization, the management structures have changed. So
right.
It's a lot of fluctuation.
Right.
So
could we have your email details? Could we have your email details? I think it would be very interesting to keep in touch.
Yeah, I will put it in the chat box right now.
Yeah.
So they really, from a perspective of a assembly line worker, you really have sheaf of the factory, a different sheaf every second or third year.
Right.
And following from that, also the structure beneath that changes its priorities.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
So it's a lot of short-lived initiatives are there. It's like kind of short-lived culture in the financial sector too, has entered the productive sector. So
yes,
to go further with technology and to improve the effectiveness of assembling cars, you need some time for some things to realize it.
yes,
And really it's kind of it just feels unstable somehow. So
yes. So it's like short-termism
the
then.
right of us workers, but it's also, I'm talking about productivity, not just from our perspective as workers. So that's just what I thought about one of the outcomes of this change in financialization.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
you'll leave us your email address.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Yeah.
Erdem, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. Actually, I mean, yeah, this is very interesting. I mean, it's cited, used a lot in the research, this short-termist understanding. I mean, but it is still kind of nuanced, actually. I mean, that yes, it is short-termist. I mean, that's how they just design their corporate strategies. But we need to understand the reasons, not only just from a financial perspective, but also from a productive perspective. I mean, for example, considering the dynamics of mergers and acquisitions, I mean, apparently the corporations are also thinking that, okay, if we cannot just improve things inside, I mean, at some point we can easily just buy another company and restructure things and then just reshuffle all the results. I mean, but acquisition is also a strategic decision. It's a kind of also with productive outcomes. I mean, it's not only a kind of financial transaction. I mean, but the idea of financialization, now the decision making is just all kind of intertwined. I mean, the financial and productive reasons and results as well are just all mixed and are just embedded into each other, that companies just then design their strategies. I mean, but because of these possibilities, thanks to acquisitions, thanks to supply chains also, I mean, that easily you can outsource things. So why do we need to just then do a kind of long-term planning inside the company? Because we can at some point easily outsource, or we can at some point easily divest, or not only just acquire, but also divest our just specific activities. Yeah, I mean, on this, yeah, this is just a kind of explains. But I mean, again, the explanation is not only about just the impact of what is going on in the financial sphere, but also, I mean, just how things are going on in the productive sphere and having an impact on changing kind of strategies. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? Conscious of time, we are almost. Yeah, just a quick question from myself, if I can. So thanks to them for the presentation. So you showed a slide with a figure with the different components for the codetermination. So you were saying for the different countries. I was wondering whether, and then you are building your argument upon the cumulative measure of these. Am I right? And then, so I was curious about the whether you have looked at the single components and especially their dynamic trend during those years, because I think that's I think you mentioned that you will be looking into Italy, but you know, some of the components had a lot of fluctuation between years, as also Michael was kind of saying. So I'm wondering whether you would like at least to explore the dynamic of that, which I think is very important. Not just taking the average.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I mean, for the moment, we have only just as kind of comparisons of averages, I mean, from each country. And but in terms of employee representation, actually, it's quite stable. I mean, it's just still a kind of short period of time. I mean, then you have one form, you usually have it for the entire period. And then, I mean, out of like 160 companies, maybe there were changes within the period for only just 20 companies or so. I mean, otherwise it was all about yes and no. I mean, we have actually trends of each. I mean, we just removed in the other version of, in the new version of our draft, because there is no trend actually, they're all the same. I mean, the only trend is about just increasing board level employee representation in France due to some regulatory changes during this period, and an increase in European works councils, which are not very important during this period in Germany, again for a specific reason. But I mean, we would like to actually, I mean, not maybe in this one, but in another paper, by using the same data, do a kind of firm level, kind of this time econometric analysis that we can just then explore further in detail different trends and the impact of each component on each variable, again on the financial side, etc. I mean, that this is again part of our research, part of our future.
Nice. And yeah, connected to that. So you are assuming that the let's say the effect is coming from the strength of workers' representation, let's say, or workers' involvement in the decision towards financialization. Have you explored the possibility of an endogeneity there, in the sense that is actually a starting lower level of financialization that is permitting a more higher, let's say, level of representation?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Again, no, because I mean, we haven't done any kind of econometric analysis or
No, I'm not talking about the econometric, but in terms of the theoretical framework. So in your framework, you seem to assume just a one-directional kind of, or at least is what I've seen from the presentation. I don't know whether in the paper you are developing that kind of reasoning.
I mean, yeah, I understand. I mean, just we say about kind of still the importance of kind of institutional embeddedness. I mean, those structures that we are still just, of course, looking for a kind of relationship, but again, by also just leaning on the regulation theory. I mean, we say that, I mean, things cannot be just fully explained by only just looking the relation between them. I mean, then it should fit into a kind of larger context. And of course, this is a kind of limitation of our just existing framework in that sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. I think we can stop here if there are no any other question, which I think is the case. So if that is all, thanks Erdem again for a very interesting presentation and discussion. Thanks Pauline for your discussion and contribution. Thanks all, and see you at the next event.
Next year.
Bye for now. Next year, next academic year. Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thanks all. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. Take care. Bye.